Hi there. Welcome to this edition of Why We Are Christians. I'm your host for this evening, Stephanie Erickson, and we are here with Bill Wagner, continuing on to our second part of the interview. Bill, thank you so much for being with us. You are a fascinating man, and you've had so many wonderful experiences. We're so glad you're sharing them with us. We left off with you talking about your missionary work, and you had mentioned that you were the consultant to all the Baptists in Europe and the Middle East. And I wanted to start exploring that a little bit, because one thing I know, one of the books that you've written is about Islam. So would you start talking to the audience and to me about how that evolved?
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I'd be glad to talk to you about that. When I was consultant for evangelism, church growth for Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Middle East, North Africa, this great big area, part of my job description was how do we win larger areas to the Lord? Mm-hmm. How do we win Turkey? They sent me to Turkey, and I had to go to Turkey and determine what was the best strategy that we as Baptists could have for entering into Turkey. Same thing for other countries of the world. What could we do and how could we do it? So I became very interested in strategy and how we might be able to win the world for Jesus Christ. Now, when I was at Fuller Theological Seminary at the School of World Missions, I remember that they had 6 top-notch professors, Dr. Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner and Ralph Winters, and names that are household names in missions area today. Mm-hmm. And Peter Wagner came to me and says, Bill, we noticed that you have a degree in civil engineering. And I said, well, that's right. He says, well, that's good because 5 of our 6 people have degrees in engineering.
Wow.
Engineers make the best church growth people.
Really?
Theologians are too idealistic and too theoretic, and engineers are practical. Uh-huh. They can build and develop things that are more useful. And so that's just my natural tendency. Mm-hmm. I'm not a real good theoretician. I preach now. I've got a church up in Rohnert Park, and I preach there. And I've got a church in Nevada, an Iranian church, and I preach there. And mm-hmm. So I do the preaching, but I think that maybe strategy and strategy development would be one of the best things for me. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened is, I would imagine about 10 years ago, I began to ask a question that I've been amazed that very few people ask. Why are some groups growing and others are not growing?
Right.
And when I talk about groups, I'm talking about churches, but I'm talking about other organizations. Some grow and some do not grow. And if you talk to some people, you'll say, well, why does this denomination grow and this one not? Well, it's because we pray. Well, no, I mean, everybody prays, but why? Well, no. And they never did come up with, I think, some really good, solid answers. So I decided to study 7 groups and to find out why these 7 groups were growing. Most of them were growing, or they had a history of growth. So I decided to study the Assemblies of God, that represented the charismatic, the Southern Baptists representing the evangelicals, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Muslims, the homosexuals, and what I call the clever organizations, the World Council of Churches, the WEA, World Evangelical Alliance, and the Sun Movement, all under one topic. And so I said, I'm going to study these 7. So I began working on them. Well, when I came to Islam, I was enthralled with Islam and what their strategy was. Mm. So what happened is I wrote a book on Islam, wow. Just that one book.
Wow.
And it was entitled How Islam Plans to Change the World. And it's been very successful. It's sold about 15,000 copies, and it's in 4 languages, German, Spanish, Korean. I'm working on it now in Chinese. And I even have a second edition with 3 different chapters on it. But I was impressed with how they had strategized to take over the world. Now, the Muslim World League, which is the main organization that carries out the strategy for the Muslims, which is located in Mecca, and is kind of a communal movement under the Muslims to change the world. They have an enormous amount of money from Saudi Arabia and from oil money, and this organization says that they will make the whole world Muslim by the year 2080. And they're ahead of time right now.
Really?
They're ahead of time.
Wow.
And as I studied them, I wanted to find out why that they were, what they were doing. And so in the book, I discovered that they basically had 4 main strategic points. Number 1, what they would call dawah, which is missions, or missions. Do you know there are more Muslim missionaries working in the United States today than there are Christian missionaries in all the Muslim countries put together?
Wow. Well, I could see where that would make sense.
Yeah.
And I think probably everyone has heard about how deep in the universities
Yes.
that Muslims, it seems like a rich mission field for them. So tell us a little bit more.
Well, they've been very, very effective in what they've done. One individual who is very high up in the staff of one of the people running for president of the United States is a lady whose mother was the head of the women's magazine for the Muslim World League in Mecca. And this lady was the editor for the girls' magazine before she came to Washington, D.C. And really what they have done now is they now have spies in very top positions in the government. And this is all a part of their strategy. They know what they're doing. But they have missions. They have building of mosques. They have built 80,000 mosques in about the last 30 years around the world. Everywhere you go, they're building new mosques. We have a mosque just down the street here that used to be a Baptist church, Hill Road Baptist Church. And they sold it to a man to make a warehouse, and he made a mosque. And so that's now a mosque. And then they have the idea of jihad, which is more of an aggressive form. And then they have immigration, and they've been very successful with immigration.
Of course, we're taking in a lot of immigrants right now. What about, I have some friends, some American women that are marrying Muslim men. Is that also one of their strategies?
Absolutely. And another group that they're working on very much is marrying Spanish women. They go down to Mexico and they marry them, and then they come over here. Do you realize that they haven't had nearly as much success in America as they had hoped? They've had a lot more success in Africa, a lot of success in Central Asia, but not very much in America. But the one group that they're winning more people to Islam are the wives of these Muslims. And these people, these poor girls that marry these guys, I just say, under no circumstances you do it. Number one, the cultural differences are too far.
Right. But once they're married, then they are pretty insistent that they convert. Is that?
Yes.
That's how they're building those numbers. Yeah.
They're not only insistent that they convert, they just assume that they've converted. And the wife has to be subject to the whims and authority of the man. So the man says, you are a Muslim. I can give you all kinds of stories on that, but we won't go into that. But no, they're very successful. They're successful in our prisons. They're successful in our schools. Very successful in our universities. They haven't been successful in being able to get into middle America as such.
Now, one thing that you talked a little bit about is in your book, I think, is the 10 mountain plan.
Right.
Can you expand on that and the macro, meta, and micro?
Let me go to that macro, meta, or micro first, because that comes from Islam. When I studied Islam, I discovered that they divided their strategy development for the Muslims into 3 layers. They called it micro, meta, Greek words, macro. Now, if you want to compare that to where we are, let's just assume that we as Southern Baptists are saying, what is our micro strategy? How are we going to win people to the Lord? Evangelism. How are we going to build churches, church planting, church growth? This is micro. This is working on the very lowest level.
Sort of the local level,
The local level, yeah. And this is what most of the people are involved in. How are you going to win your neighbor to the Lord?
Right.
And develop a micro level. And by the way, both the charismatics and the Southern Baptists are excellent on the micro level. We're better than just about anybody. That's why we're growing. Then you have the meta level. The meta level is how do you influence a city or a state or a county? And that's when you begin to create seminaries or universities or schools where you influence a larger segment of the society. Then you have what they call macro, and macro is how do you change the society? How do you influence the whole society? And in my studies, I studied all these 7 groups. And I came to the conclusion that of these 7 groups, only 3 of them had a macro strategy in place, and that's the Muslims, the Mormons, and the homosexuals. And all 3 of them have been very successful at the macro level.
Which is the government in a
It's
huge way.
working with the government, it's working with the society as a whole. And that comes into the second area that you had mentioned, and that was this 10 mountains. Bill Bright and several other mission leaders got together, about 15 years ago, and they created 7 mountains of cultural influence. I increased it to 10 because I felt like they just put it down on a napkin and had 7, but I think there's really 10.
You formalized it. Okay.
And so what it is a culture can be broken up into 7 or 10 different categories. For instance, education, government, business, family, sport, technology, art and theater, media, in all of these different things. So you divide that up into this, and then you come along and you say, how do we influence this culture through education?
Got it.
How do we influence this through government? And if you look at the Southern Baptists, we do not produce movies. We do not produce television programs. The Muslims do, the Mormons do, and the homosexuals influence the whole theatrical area tremendously.
Right.
Right now, it's getting more and more difficult to find one of these programs that doesn't have a homosexual character.
Right.
They've been able to influence, but that has all been because of the strategy that they have developed. And we just simply have not done that. I'll give you a good idea, talking about the Mormons. By the way, one of the things that happens when I talk to leaders, and I talk to the leaders of denominations all the time, and I say, let's create a macro strategy. I say, now let's look at the Mormons, or let's look at the Well, we can't look at them. They're not Christians. Well,
but that's not the point.
That's not the point.
Right.
What I want to look is what is their strategy?
strategy.
Yeah. Let's look at the government. The Baptist Press came out not too long ago with a statement that says, in Washington, D.C., there are now 25,000 Mormons who are working in government positions in Washington, D.C., 25,000. And they have an office to get Mormons positions in there. Now, I've heard several people say that they control 2 areas of government. One is the agricultural area, and one is the economy area. I don't know. I do know that a large percentage of our FBI agents are Mormons. I've seen one person that said 40% are Mormons, another one said at least 20% are Mormons. CIA has a much higher number of Mormons. And what they have done is they said, we are going to get our people into areas of government. And the first time I ran across this was in 1960 when I read a book entitled Hidden in Plain Sight. And in that, the author of that book was analyzing the Mormon strategy, and they said, the Mormons have said they will have a president of the United States by the year 2000.
Almost. Almost.
But you see, that was their strategy.
Right.
This was not accidental. They knew what they were doing.
But do they feel that if there is, let's say, a Mormon president, that somehow that will influence people to become Mormons?
Yes. And it works that way.
And what about, is that representative of the population, the number of Mormons that are in government, or do you think it's
far beyond what the population is, far beyond.
Is there a count, for instance, of Southern Baptists in the government?
No, because we don't even try to do it. We
Okay.
do have a count of senators and representatives, and at one time we were pretty high. At one time, we had the 4 people in line to be president of the United States were all Baptists.
Wow.
Bill Clinton and the vice president, all the way down. They were all Southern Baptists.
Oh, that's interesting.
But we never, it wasn't strategized, it was just accidental.
Okay.
But I
Okay.
can give you some other areas of where these groups are business. You see, the homosexuals came along, and the homosexuals were pretty much on the outside, looked down upon. And so in 1990, about 1990, there were 2 guys from Harvard University, Mattson and Kirk, and they wrote a book entitled After the Ball, and they said, here is a strategy whereby we as homosexuals will be able to have a much greater influence in the American society. And they said, this is what we're going to do, and they have done it. And one of the areas that they said they were going to work in was in business. And they said, we are going to influence businesses to where they will support the homosexual agenda and where they will give us money. And they said the way you do that is you begin to work with the you begin to work with the board of directors, and you find one man that's sympathetic, and then you get a second man on the board, and a third and fourth, until you have a majority of the board, and the board is the one that will give us the right to get money from them. And it succeeded. Strategy, that's what they did. But Baptists don't do that, Assemblies of God don't do it, even the Jehovah's Witnesses don't do it. The other 3 are all good at the micro and meta. And all I'm saying is, why don't we begin to look at some of these things and find more effective ways to do our mission work?
Do you have an answer to that question? Why we don't do it? Or why the Southern Baptist Convention doesn't do it?
Well, you know, Kodak, when Polaroid cameras came out, the guy that developed the Polaroid, Dr. Land, took his invention to Kodak and said, here we can develop such a camera. And they looked at it and they said, no, we didn't develop it here, we won't do it. And they turned it down. And they lost quite a bit by turning it down.
Right.
And so the whole idea is we did not do it here. Now, let me give you the Mormon again. And the only reason why I'm talking about the Mormons is because the Mormons, the Muslims, and the homosexuals do have a mega strategy in place.
Right.
Do you realize that they use college students for their missionaries? You can go to anybody here and I've sent my students all throughout Marin County, and I said, ask people this: what do you think of the Baptists? What do you think of the Mormons? And what do you think of the Muslims? Almost everybody came to the same answer. The Muslims, well, that's a world religion, and some of them are aggressive, but by and large, it's a peaceful religion. What do you think of the Mormons? The Mormons are very much family-oriented. They have 2 young men that go out as missionaries, and the young men do missionary work, and they're good people. What do you think of the Southern Baptists? They're bigots, they're terrible. And see, what it is we have no strategy to try to better our image. And so if you say in Marin County today that you're a Southern Baptist, watch out, they'll throw things at you.
Right.
And we have no strategy to change that. So the Mormons have these young men, and it's fascinating. Do you realize that today the Mormons have 80,000 missionaries out in the world working today?
Wow.
80,000.
Wow.
And they are doing nothing but evangelism and discipleship. And they are paying their own way, and they are very strict. They get up at a certain time in the morning, they go to bed at a certain time at night. They are very strict in what they do and how they work. And within about 5 years, that number is going to be 100,000, and it's going straight up.
So contrast that to the number of Southern Baptist missionaries.
Southern Baptist has about 5,000 missionaries, full-time missionaries. We have about 400 college students. Then we do have about 50,000 volunteers that go over for a week or 10 days. And that's fairly good. But they have these missionaries, they're there for 2 years. And in 2 years, they learn the language. And they begin to develop and work within the language. And so their whole system is is fascinating.
So these 6 religions or 6 groups of people that you've identified, some of them, the Muslims, the homosexual community, and the Mormons, are really growing
Yes.
and being more socially accepted.
Yes. At the
Whereas
mega level.
At the meta and the macro.
Well, the macro level.
At the macro level.
Yeah.
Yet the Southern Baptist, or let's just not even say Southern Baptist, evangelical,
Evangelicals, yeah.
is shrinking. Would you say it's shrinking?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So that seems to be also correlated to the fact that society has sort of rejected Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world and is looking for more, if you will, socially acceptable and broader ways. It seems like that's really what's happening is, you know, our world is just turning against the traditional Christian values and theology.
Well, you were right and you were wrong. The world is turning against it, the Western world.
The Western
The
world.
developing world is growing very rapidly. And
Okay.
they're very conservative, and they're growing in Africa, they're growing. Do you realize that the greatest revival that has ever taken place on the face of this earth is taking place right now in
Really?
China?
Really?
And you've got to remember that in China, after 250 years of missionary work from Protestants and Catholics, at the end of that period of time, they had probably, let's say about, 250 million Christians.
Wow.
Now they have 800 million Christians.
Wow.
So they have just about tripled in size. After the wall has come down, the wall came down, and when the wall came down, they tripled.
But aren't Christians persecuted in China?
Yes, that's no problem.
So they're persecuted and they're growing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow, that says a lot.
The school I'm at has all of these Chinese. I teach Chinese all the time. And all of the ones I know have just recently become Christians. Very thrilled with the gospel. They're just wonderful kids.
They're open.
Yeah.
They're open.
Yeah.
Where the Western world has really closed in a lot of ways, in their heart.
Yeah. Now, that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about Southern Baptists have grown every year up until about 5 years ago, and now they're decreasing. And I have gone to us and I said, we've got to find ways to grow, but it's a voice in the wilderness at this point. Now, one of the things that has happened is that the World Evangelical Alliance, that represents 600 million churches, is open to us. And the organization that I've created now will be working very closely with the World Evangelical Alliance to develop mega strategies for the various countries of the world, and so we're working on that now.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. So, Bill, tell us, what does a typical day look like for you? You have so many things going. Now I know how you start your days. I think you told me. Why don't you tell the audience? Because I think they'll really like that.
Well, that's interesting. You know, you're talking about my life. It's been fascinating. I run every day, 5 to 10 kilometers. I play racquetball every day for about 2 hours at the YMCA.
That is amazing.
And
I love
in fact, the local newspaper, the IJ, came out with an article, and the article was 5 of us people who are over the age of 80 that played racquetball every day, and so I do that.
Wow.
And I was written up in Runner's World for having run in 1,200 different cities and towns in the world.
Oh my gosh.
And over 100 countries. I've run in over 100 countries. And so every day I would run. It's just been a part of who I am. And I pray when I run because I'm multitasking in so much of the things that I do.
Right.
But now what I'm working on is I'm working on very much on trying to help my son, who's a missionary in Europe. He has his PhD degree in missions. and he is kind of in charge of working with the immigrants, and I'm trying to help him. That's why we started that church about 4 or 5 months ago in Cologne for refugees. So I'm helping him. I'm trying to develop this program for the Institute for Global Strategic Studies. I started that one church I mentioned, the Iranian church. We have an Iranian church, and we meet on Friday night with the Iranian church, and have a Bible study in San Francisco for the Iranians on Wednesday, and then I teach a senior Bible study at my church on Thursday, and then I have the Friday night church, and then I have my church in Rohnert Park on Sunday, and then just trying to keep up with all the letters. And then I'm writing 4 books right now. I'm writing one book on my life, how I'm writing a book now on these 7 different things. I'm trying to finish that one up. I wrote one on how the homosexuals are trying to change the world. And then I wrote another book that I find fascinating. And I believe that there are some hidden things in the Bible that nobody really thinks too much about, and God kind of threw them in. For instance, the third heaven. Paul went to the third heaven. What's the third heaven?
What is that? Right.
And yet there undoubtedly are 3 heavens. That's just one little statement, and the enormity of this is great, but God decided not to let us know. The creation, I don't think I'm firmly convinced that there's 2 creations. From in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth as one, and then the second one is, and the world was void and without form. If the world was destroyed because of the war in heaven, we're saved. That's another one. There was a war in heaven, and Satan fought against the angels.
Right.
We don't know too much about that.
Right.
And yet it was up there. Then one of the statements that I think is fascinating in the Bible, and God created the stars also. Do you realize how far those stars are from? And
amazing.
How enormous it?
Can't even fathom it.
One little, and God created the stars also. And what I'm saying is there are statements in the Bible, 2%, that are enormous. What's eternity going to be like when we go to eternity? We have no idea. And yet, a little 2% statement. But that's another book. So you just see that I enjoy. I can write. That's a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
I don't read, but I can write. I have to learn through visual and through audio, listening to people, listening to tapes. And I can write. I'm not too bad of a writer, but I'm not a good reader.
Interesting. But you've compensated. Obviously, you've compensated for it really well.
Well, yeah, you have to.
Yeah.
But I have been so much impressed with the way the Lord leads, and both of my kids are very deep Christians, and they're both very missionary in what they do.
That's a blessing.
And my wife has been a wonderful help, and so it's just been a fascinating. One thing that it just amazes me. I have been ordained for 61 years.
Wow.
I have pastored probably 10 churches in my life. Do you realize I have only been to 17 funerals my entire life?
Really?
I have only conducted 4 funerals, and I've only had 3 people, members of my church, die. People do not die around me.
Wow, I want to hang out around you
Yeah,
because
it's
unfortunately I've been to
Lately,
way too
yeah.
many funerals in just the last year. So, wow,
I don't
that's
know- I don't know,
incredible
yeah.
because you just disclosed yourself that you are over 80.
Yeah.
So typically, people around
Die
you
around
start
me.
to go.
All my
right.
church members are 80. Just about too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, can I touch you?
Right, yeah. But it's amazing, and so I'm very pleased that the Lord has blessed me on that.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about healing, and we do some healing, but the Lord has not given me the gift of healing as such. That's not a part, but
Well, He's given you a lot of gifts, so.
well,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'll stick with what I got. I'm happy.
You have been an amazing help to the world, and I think you've aptly explained why you are a Christian. You've talked about wanting to win people for the Lord, and you haven't just talked about it. You've put action to your words, and thank you for doing that,
Yes.
Bill. Thank you for everything that you have done for the work of the Lord.
Well, thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah. Thank you, audience, for joining Why We Are Christians today. We are so happy that you have tuned in, and we hope that you've heard both segments of Bill Wagner and his amazing story. Thank you, Bill. Please tune in again for Why We Are Christians. Stephanie Erickson signing off.
Okay, thank you.